Have you ever tried to make a 3-yard quilt with a fat quarter bundle? Well, I just did, and I love how it turned out. Let me show you how I did it. Hi, it's Hannah with Fabric Café, and welcome back to What Quilting Taught Me. This is a series where I show you a quilt that I have made, how I changed things up, and how I maybe broke the rules, plus any mistakes or problems I ran into during the process and how I solved those. Today, I'm going to show you how I used a fat quarter bundle that I have had for years in one of our standard 3-yard quilts. Plus, I did curve piecing. So let's go check out my quilts. So this is our Cameo quilt, and I wanted a quilt to use a fat quarter bundle in. And I've had this bundle for several years, and I thought it was finally time to use it. I really liked this pattern because of all these individual ovals. I thought it was a perfect place to put all of my different fabrics. And as you can see, I used some of the fat quarters in multiple of the ovals and just spread them out throughout the quilt to balance my prints. For my borders, I took scraps from my fat quarters after cutting my other pieces from them, and I made this fun scrappy border. I also added a border here with a purple scrap from my stash because I felt like the quilt needed some grounding between all of this center piecing and the scrappy border. And it just gave the quilts a place for your eyes to rest. I also used this same purple for my binding so that it would tie it all together. And then for my big border, I didn't have quite enough fabric to make it all one color. So I did one print on the sides and one on the top and bottom. And I put the purple floral on the sides because it was my favorite and I wanted to see that one the most. Now, before I started cutting out all of my fabrics, I sorted them out and I made a little sketch. But before we look at that, let's see what this quilt would look like with 3 yards of fabric. Let's look at a 3-yard version with running yardage so that you can get a similar vibe to mine. Now we have something very fun for this kit too. This fabric is designed by Mac Cox, and you may have seen her YouTube channel, MA Couture Crafting, which if you haven't, you should definitely check her out. She does a lot of work with 3-yard quilts over there. We collaborated with Mac on the book Curve Appeal with 3-yard quilts, and she designed all of the patterns in this book. So it only seemed fitting to put her fabric in her patterns. Something I love about this fabric, it has a very soft ombre, so it adds a lot of subtle movement, which gives your quilt piecing a lot of interest. So for our number 1, we picked this one that has a lot of different colors. We've got some purple and pink, red, orange, yellow. It's like a sunset. And this is gonna go in all of our big ovals right here. Then our number 2 is this soft orange. And this has just a very subtle ombre throughout the fabric. It goes from light to dark and light to dark throughout the whole thing, just giving a lot of movement. And that's gonna go everywhere these squares are here, as well as on our border right here, a big border. For our fabric number 3, we wanted a lot of contrast from our number 1 so that it would pop in these sections right here. And so we picked her like kind of purpley blue texture of ombre. And it looks so good in the quilt. You can see all of the different movement in there. That ombre makes it look kind of like it's glowing almost, like it's got this light shining through the piecing. I think it turned out really, really pretty. I love it with this kit. But let's see what it looks like next to mine, and we can see the difference. And there is a stark difference between these two. Both are beautiful. You can do whatever you want with this pattern, but I almost think the piecing is more prominent on the 3-yard version, and then the fabric is more of the like punch in my version. So it just kind of depends on what you're looking for in your pattern. Now this kit is available at fabriccafe.com, and we have even more kit options using Mac's new fabric. So be sure to go check those out. Now I actually got all of my fat quarters at a quilt show from the designer P. Carter Carpin, and I love her whimsical prints and all of the bright colors. So I pulled together a bundle to use. And when I was working on this quilt, the very first thing I did was to divide my fabrics into focus, light, and dark. I decided to put all of my focus prints in my large ovals in this pattern. My lights were perfect to use as the number 2 fabrics that were between the oval squares, you know, that connecting line. And then I used my dark fabrics for these curved edges and just alternated the colors in my rows so I could see them all. Now I had 2 different fat quarters that I had 2 of. So I decided to pull these out of my dark stack and make them my big border. And then to tie them all together, I pulled this purple fabric scrap from my stash for this extra border and this binding. Now for my backing, I got another fabric by the same designer, and it's this beautiful, nice teal. It's actually the same print as my purple border, but in a nice teal. And I liked that it was a contrasting color from all of the front, but it still had that teal that is a very common through line with all my other fabrics. Because I had so many colors and prints that I was playing with, I actually made a drawing of my quilt before I started cutting anything out. This is completely optional. I am a very visual person, so whenever I'm doing big projects like this, it really helps me to sketch it out. Now, I don't usually add all of the color. I just do a little pencil drawing and make notes. But since the big thing I was focused on was the prints, I thought I needed to add that. So here's my beautiful drawing, as you can see, with my little notes of what is what fabric. So if I come back later and I get confused, I know what it is. So this helped me see how I was gonna lay everything out. Once I decided where all of my fabrics were gonna go, I started planning out what I needed to cut from each piece. I just went through and I jotted down how many curves and rectangles I was going to need from each fabric going down my design. I had that in my handy dandy little notebook, wrote down my little shorthand for what the fabric was, and wrote down what I was gonna cut. Then I just used whatever fabric was left over to cut into strips for my scrappy border. And this made cutting super simple. I just went down this list and cut everything I needed from one fat quarter at a time. If this seems overwhelming or too much work, you definitely don't have to do this. You could just make a handful of blocks from each fabric and let them fall where they will, which would give them a fun, scrappy, organic look. Now, many people are intimidated by curved piecing, which I understand. I was too, until I tried it. Turns out that I actually love doing curved piecing. The cutting part does take a little bit longer, but I find the piecing very satisfying. You sew one seam and you have this super cool curved block. So the first step in making your curves is to cut with the fabric strips. Fat quarters are not as wide as a full yard of fabric, but I still make my cut the exact same way. My width of fabric is just not as wide. I would start on the selvage edge and cut a strip the whole length of my fat quarter. Since I was going fat quarter by fat quarter, after I made my width of fabric cuts, then I would cut out my curves. When I do curve piecing, I like to make a template from the book. And if you would like to learn how I make my curve templates, then be sure to check out our video where I walk you through that. After I make the templates, I will then transfer them to freezer paper. So here is one of each for my big curve and then the part that's gonna go right there. Freezer paper has 2 sides to it. This paper side, which is the part I always mark what template it is, and then a tacky side right here. If you lay the tacky side down onto your fabric and press it, it will stick to your fabric, which makes it a lot easier to cut. And it will not leave any sticky residue. Plus, they are reusable. I usually make 4 to 6 freezer paper templates per quilt, and they last me the whole time. Something to make sure though is that you do not use steam when you are pressing these onto your fabric. You can lay these out on your strip of fabric and iron all of them at once, or you can lay them down and press them one at a time. And in our curve book, we have a curve cutting diagram, which shows you how to lay out your curves to get the most out of your fabric. I just lay my freezer paper templates on my fabric, following that suggested layout. Once you have your templates pressed down, it's time to cut your curves. Something I do to help make my cutting go faster is that I lay multiple strips on top of one another. I will do this before I press my templates onto my fabric. I feel like that gives them a little bit more stability. You just need to make sure that your fabric strips are nice and lined up before you start cutting. You will have to push a little bit harder, but I think it's worth it since you'll be getting multiple curves from one cut. Now, if I was using yardage, I would have kept my fabric folded in half with our selvage edges matching and just stack a couple of those on top of each other. which allows you to get 4 curves from 1 cut. Since I'm using fat quarters, I don't have as much length. So I just pressed my strips flat and stacked 2 to 3 strips on top of each other, just depending on how many curves I needed from that print. When I'm cutting my curves out, I like to use a square ruler to trim off my straight edges and cut the curves apart into sections of 2. This makes it easier to cut out those curves and keep them lined up because I don't have extra fabric and curves getting in my way. For cutting my curve, I just carefully go along the edge of my template with my rotary cutter. Make sure your blade is nice and fresh because this will make this part a lot easier. I like to move my hand around the edge of my curved template just to make sure it stays in place and the fabric doesn't shift. Just make sure not to get your fingers too close. Now, once I cut my curves out, I peel off the paper and our fabric is ready to go. After I cut everything out, I needed to make sure that I was sewing the right pieces together. So I laid out all of my template E curves, this smaller curve, and I started sorting them into piles with the different focus fabrics. I just went through the drawing I made at the beginning and I made little stacks of how many curves got the blue flower curve, how many got the red flower curve, and how many got the pink dot curve. Then I set them off to the side in their neat little piles and I made my curves, going through one fabric at a time. Pinning is very important when you're making curve pieces. This helps you stay on track. Before I start pinning, I like to get a little crease in the center of each curve to give me a guide. To speed up this process, I would usually iron multiple curves at a time. I would fold a bunch in half and then hit them all with the iron at once. After they were pressed, I would start pinning them. I always use 3 pins for curves, 1 in the center and 1 on each end. I put my pieces right sides together, matching that crease I just made, and put a pin through that first. I go through the front of my fabric to the back and then loop it back to the front. Then I'm gonna line up the straight edge of my smaller curve on the edge of my larger curve piece. Now, when I'm making larger curved blocks, I found that I only had to loop my pin through my fabric once when I was pinning those edges. But these curves were a little bit smaller. So I found that I needed to go back through my fabric again to make sure that it held really securely. Don't worry about the bubbles between your pins. I know it feels really weird, but it's gonna work out just fine when you sew them together. Now for this quilt, I would pin all of one colorway at once and then sew those. Then I would do another colorway until they were all done. This broke up the tasks so I didn't have to do too much pinning at a time. Whenever I'm sewing curves, there are a few settings I like to change on my machine. First, I always work with my needle in the down position. This is helpful because if you need to pause and adjust anything, your needle is not going to move. Second, I like to lower my machine speed just a little bit. I just go down 1 speed, but you can lower it to whatever is most comfortable for you. I feel like this makes it easier to get my seams more exact. Now I'm just gonna sew 1/4 inch from the edge of my curve. You wanna make sure that you're keeping those edges flat and together. You will probably have to adjust as you go, and that is completely fine. That's where working with the needle in the down position really comes in handy. Even though I'm doing more intricate sewing than just a straight line, I still like to chain piece. I just feed one curved block after another, so you'll end up with a long string of curved blocks. Or in our case for this quilt, units. After you've got your curve sewn, it's time to press. I always press my seams open for every quilt, but I find it especially helpful on curves. I think it gets it extra flat, and it makes your units easier to match up when you're sewing them together. Once all of my curves were sewn together, it was time to start sewing my rows together. Now, I wanted to make sure that I had all of my units laid out in the right place. So I laid everything out on the floor. I used the pattern and my drawing as my guide to make sure I put everything where it needed to go. When I was sewing my blocks into my rows, I would take 2 to 3 rows at a time and lay them out by my machine. I like to try and make sure that I could see a whole oval at once. This was a really helpful way for me to make sure that my blocks were in the right spot and turned correctly. I would sew each row by themselves, press them, and then sew those rows together. Then I would pick up the next 2 to 3, depending on what part of my oval I was needing. I would pin everywhere a seam met up, just like I would if I was working with squares or half square triangles or something. The method doesn't change even though it's a curve. Now for my first border, I just decided to use the cutting instructions for that number 1 border in the pattern. because I liked the size of it and I just really wanted a pop of purple. For my scrappy border, I again used the instructions for the quilt's border number 1. I just took a bunch of different scrap strips, sewed them end to end, and then sewed them onto the side of the quilt. Once the quilt was done, it was time for quilting. Now I sent this to one of our long arm quilters, Mitzi Pearson, and a link is in the description to her website so you can check her out. She sent me 3 different designs, and she always puts the design overlay on top of the quilt in a different color, very contrasting, so that I could see the design. The first one she sent was called Over the Rainbow, and this one has all of these nice design of it like moving along the quilt. It kind of mimics that oval, which I think is really fun. Then our number 2 was called Champagne Bubbles, and it's all of these different little bubbles, which I think is nice because it picks up a bunch of the circular movement in the fabrics. Our number 3 is called Swirly Bubbles, and this one kind of takes pieces from both of the other quilt designs and puts them in one. So ultimately, I chose number 1 because I liked the way that it mimicked that round design in the quilt with its ovals. And Mitzi and I also discussed something before I picked this design. Because all of the fabrics in my quilt were prints and I really didn't have any solid fabrics, the quilt design and thread wasn't going to show up quite as much as it would on some other quilts. It was really just going to give the quilt dimension. So for that reason, I think that mimicking the movement of the quilt really worked. It just kind of gave it that extra depth it needed. Mitzi sent me a picture of 3 different thread colors laid out on the quilt. I fully intended to pick pink for this quilt. I made this quilt with pink thread in mind, but I thought the purple one blended the best with all of the fabrics. There was a lot more purple in this quilt than I was expecting, so it seemed to tie all of it together. And for the back, she just used a nice soft gray, which I think complements the teal really nicely. I love the way it turned out with the quilting. I really think it does give it that depth that Mitzi was talking about. I wanted to take a minute and share something fun that one of you made. Patty made this version of our pavilion pattern. And Patty, when I saw this, my jaw dropped. I made a quilt very much like this and showed it in a video a little while back. I used a layer cake and some jelly roll strips. Well, Patty had the same fabric and did something similar to mine, only made it better. It looks amazing. I love your disbursement of colors, and your quilting is perfect for this fabric. And I love that you used the same fabric for your binding that you have on your border. She also made an amazing custom backing using the jelly roll strips. That was such a creative idea, and it looks so fantastic. Patty, I am so honored that you liked what I did and that it could inspire you to create your own quilt and use up some of that fabric stash. If you would like the chance to have one of your quilts featured in a video or on our social, then send your pictures to quiltstars@fabriccafe.com. If you would like to make your own Cameo quilt, then don't forget about that kit I showed you earlier. It's available at fabriccafe.com, but quantities are limited. And if you like this pattern, it's from our book, Curve Appeal with 3-Yard Quilts. Don't be intimidated by curves. They're a lot easier than they look, and I think they're a lot of fun. If you would like to get even more help with curves though, be sure to watch the video that pops up. Happy quilting!